Picture this. You're tied to a stone slab. The air is thick with the scent of burning myrrh and blood. Around you, a circle of robed priests sway to the rhythm of an ancient drumbeat, their chants spiraling through the chamber like the echo of a god's breath. You try to move, but the sacred bindings hold. You're not here for punishment. You're here for purification. For rebirth. For the ritual. This is Babylon. This is the temple of Ishtar. And you are the offering. What you're about to experience isn't a scene from a horror movie. It's a historical reconstruction based on real temple inscriptions, unearthed tablets, and banned translations that most modern textbooks still refuse to acknowledge. Because in ancient Babylon, sex wasn't just pleasure. It wasn't even just religion. It was cosmic warfare. It was how the gods maintained order in the universe. And the priests? They were the generals, the gatekeepers of flesh and divinity. The line between God and human, sacred and profane, wasn't just blurred, it was shattered. Every body that entered the temple was a tool, a key, a sacrifice, a communion wafer, and sometimes, a weapon. The temple priests of Babylon, particularly those who served Ishtar, believed they could channel the gods through ritualized intercourse. Sex wasn't metaphorical. It wasn't symbolic. It was literal possession. To touch the flesh of the priest was to touch the divine. To submit to their rituals was to be purified by the gods. And for many that meant surrendering body, identity, and sanity to rituals that lasted for hours, sometimes days. Victims, initiates, were selected from across the empire. Some were volunteered. Others were taken. A few even believed it was an honor. Until the incense burned out. Until the drums stopped. Until they looked into the mirror and didn't recognize the person who had survived. If they survived. Historical tablets reference the tearing of the vessel, the loosening of the body, and the breaking of the gate, phrases scholars now believe refer not to poetic transformation, but to very real acts of violation masked as divine ceremony. These weren't isolated cases. This was a system. A sacred infrastructure built on the bodies of the vulnerable, justified by theology and sustained by fear. It was called enlightenment, but it felt like damnation. And this is just the beginning. If this already made you uncomfortable, imagine what's coming next. Subscribe to the History Scar. Or if you can't stomach the truth, tell us why in the comments. Because what you're about to discover will haunt every history book you thought you could trust. Welcome to the unholy rites of Babylon. The priests didn't call it abuse. They called it divine union. In the temples of ancient Babylon and Sumer, sex wasn't hidden, it was institutionalized, ritualized, canonized into the very fabric of religious life. At the center of this sacred theater stood a goddess whose power transcended boundaries, Ishtar, also known as Inanna, the deity of love, war, and desire. She was the divine embodiment of both creation and destruction. Worshipping her meant embracing both extremes. And to serve her meant surrendering everything, body, mind, and future. Sacred prostitution. That's the name modern scholars give it. But in the clay tablets etched with cuneiform 3,000 years ago, it went by another term, holy marriage. To marry the goddess was an honor. At least that's how the priests framed it. In practice, it was the first step into a lifelong sentence. Children were often dedicated to the temple at birth, promised by their parents in return for divine favor. Fertile fields, healthy livestock, protection from plagues. These temple-bound infants were raised not as individuals, but as instruments. Their names were sometimes never recorded. They were given titles, Bride of Ishtar, Vessel of the Moon, Dancer of the Flame. By the age of 6 or 7, training began. Ritual songs, chants, gestures of seduction. Movements choreographed to mimic the goddess in her many moods, fierce, submissive, insatiable. The boys were trained to become eunuch priests or soft-skinned intermediaries, their masculinity stripped away, not just by ceremony but by blade. The girls? They were prepped for the most sacred rite of all, the first union. This ceremony marked the moment they would be claimed by a senior priest or temple official, an act believed to sanctify them and awaken the divine within. The tablets do not disguise it. One reads, "The girl is taken beneath the stars. Oil is poured on her brow. The god enters her through his servant." It was called a marriage. It was treated as a celebration. But for the child it was something else entirely. The power dynamics weren't spiritual. They were structural. The priests wielded full control, religious, legal, physical. To disobey was to defy the goddess herself. And in Babylon that was treason against the cosmos. Some initiates became permanent fixtures of the temple's sexual system. expected to perform for pilgrims, nobles and soldiers alike, each encounter branded as worship. Others were leased to foreign travelers under the temple's authority, spreading Ishtar's rites beyond city walls, becoming ambassadors of divine flesh. And the psychological toll? Described even then in coded prayers. She speaks but does not feel. She dances but cannot rest. Her eyes are open while she dreams. These were words carved into clay by those who could not scream aloud. Words left behind by the broken. It's easy to imagine temple life as a spiritual escape. Ornate robes, incense, golden altars. That's the image often painted in modern books. But those who lived it knew better. The temple wasn't a sanctuary. It was a factory of obedience. A holy prison, gilded by the language of gods and sealed with silence. Because who dares question the divine? How is this not in textbooks? Because someone decided you weren't ready to know the truth. But now you are. Prove it. Subscribe to the History Scar and join those brave enough to face the past uncensored. They called it pure blood. Not because it was clean but because it was untouched, unspilled, sacred. In the temples of ancient Mesopotamia, virginity was more than a physical state. It was a form of currency. A spiritual contract. A gate between this world and the divine. And the moment it was broken, that rupture was never just symbolic. Across the ruins of Babylon and Uruk, carved into limestone and baked into cuneiform tablets, appear chilling phrases. The blood of the first gate is accepted. The goddess smiles at the offering of the unopened flower. No man shall enter before the priest has opened the way. These aren't poetic metaphors. They're ritual instructions. Because in the religion of Ishtar, virgin blood was a consecration, a necessary gift to appease the gods, to maintain divine favor, to renew the land. Young girls, dedicated from childhood, were raised not only for service, but for sacrifice. The rite of first union was not simply an initiation. It was a performance. A public declaration that their body had become divine property, and it had to be witnessed. Descriptions in temple records reveal how girls as young as 12 were prepared for this ritual in a process known as the veiling. For weeks they would fast, bathe in sacred oils, recite chants of surrender. They were wrapped in white linen robes to signify unbroken purity. On the night of the ritual, they were unveiled before a select council of priests. And then, beneath the image of Ishtar carved into the temple wall, they were offered. Not symbolically. Not metaphorically. Literally. Senior clergy would perform the rite. Witnesses would record the act on clay. The girl's blood, sometimes caught in linen, sometimes in bowls, was offered to the flame. To refuse this rite was unthinkable. To resist was blasphemy. In one tablet recovered from Nippur, the priest writes, "She wept 3 times. She bled once. The gods are satisfied." Even menstrual blood was not exempt. In certain temples, girls were monitored for their first cycle, considered a signal that they were ripening for the gods. This blood too was considered holy. Mixed with wine and ash, it was smeared on temple walls, burned in censers or poured at the feet of idols. Some ceremonies required the girls to sit upon sacred stones until the flow stopped, leaving a mark of acceptance that priests interpreted as divine blessing. But not every ritual ended with survival. Some tablets make reference to total offerings, a chilling euphemism believed to describe girls who were not just deflowered, but bled until death. These victims were hailed as chosen ones, martyrs who had ascended to the goddess herself. One passage, translated only in the last decade, reads, "She gave her gate. She gave her breath. The moon wept and Ishtar sang." Were these exceptions? Perhaps. But in a system that saw blood as holy and purity as power, the line between worship and destruction was razor thin. Modern scholars have long debated whether these accounts are literal or allegorical. But the evidence, the bowls, the blood-stained linens, the burned bones found beneath temple altars, paints a story more visceral than metaphor ever could. In Babylon, purity was not preserved. It was consumed, ritualized, sacrificed. Because to touch the divine, someone had to bleed. They wore makeup made from crushed minerals, sang in falsetto voices, and draped themselves in silk robes dyed with sacred indigo. But these were not women. They were gala priests, a caste of men who, in devotion to the gods, surrendered more than flesh. They surrendered identity. In the sacred courts of Sumer and Babylon, under the towering ziggurats and shadow of the moon goddess, the gala priests held a strange and powerful role. They were singers of lamentation, keepers of divine rites, intermediaries between gods and mortals. But to fulfill their divine duties, they first had to become something else. neither male nor female, neither citizen nor slave. They became the embodiment of transformation, of fluidity, of submission to the will of the divine. In service to Inanna, goddess of sex, war and sacred contradiction, these men were required to assume not only feminine behavior, but a feminine form. The rituals of initiation were neither symbolic nor cosmetic. They were surgical. Clay tablets discovered in the temple ruins of Eridu and Ur speak of a rite known as the severing of the seed. The act was presented not as mutilation, but as divine offering. One translated inscription reads, "The essence of man is poured into the sand. The body is made hollow for the goddess to fill." This wasn't metaphor. It was castration, performed with obsidian knives, often without anesthetic, sometimes witnessed by temple authorities to ensure purity. Afterward, the initiate was veiled for 7 days, fed honey and milk, and taught to walk, speak, and move as one reborn. The pain was said to be proof of devotion. The transformation, a sacred death followed by spiritual resurrection. From that point forward, the gala priest was no longer a man, nor was he allowed to call himself such. He was now a wife of the god, a vessel empty to be filled with divine presence. Ritual texts describe them entering trance-like states during ceremonies, believed to be possessions by Inanna herself. In these moments, their voices would rise, their bodies would shake, and their pronouns would shift without hesitation. Outsiders didn't always understand. Foreign scribes wrote with confusion and revulsion about these half-men, these howling women with the faces of soldiers. But in Babylon their identity was sacred. They were trusted with the most intimate rituals, the darkest secrets, and the most powerful invocations. Some served in roles akin to sacred courtesans, offering themselves in ritual sex meant to mirror divine unions. Others served as oracles, their altered bodies believed to make them more receptive to the whispers of the gods. The physical change was permanent, but it was the psychological shift that carved deeper scars. From adolescence, they were taught to suppress instinct, to reinterpret every human urge through the lens of duty. To feel love, to want family, to remember the self, these were sins against purpose. They had become the goddess's voice, her body, her silence. And though their faces were painted and their smiles rehearsed, behind the veils were eyes that had seen what obedience truly cost. Still think ancient religions were peaceful and wise? What if they sacrificed identity itself on the altar of obedience? Subscribe to the History Scar if you believe this history must be heard. For 11 months of the year, the temples of Babylon demanded obedience, silence, and submission. But when the 12th month ended and the spring sun returned to the earth, the gates of order were thrown wide open. And in their place came madness. The Akitu festival, Babylon's New Year celebration, was a holy eruption of chaos. A ritualized implosion of all rules, identities, and power. What began as a celestial commemoration of Marduk's victory over chaos soon became the most unhinged religious spectacle of the ancient world. Over the course of 12 days, the city transformed into something unrecognizable. Laws were suspended. Hierarchies reversed. The streets, once patrolled by armed scribes and priests, now pulsed with feverish crowds dressed as gods, monsters, animals, and kings. At the heart of it all stood the Temple of Asagila, where Marduk's statue was carried out into the open air, an event so sacred that even foreign armies knew not to attack during Akitu. But behind the sacred chants and incense clouds, a darker ritual unfolded. Inside the temples, priests and priestesses prepared for what they called the sacred marriage. These weren't performances for public delight. They were reenactments of divine copulation, played out in chambers lined with stone, fire, and flesh. The king himself, or a chosen substitute, would take on the role of Marduk. A high priestess would become Ishtar. Their union was meant to renew the cosmos, to simulate the birth of time itself. But this was only the surface. Outside the official rites, the real revelry began. Temple records speak of mass rituals involving hundreds, sometimes thousands, of participants. The lines between ritual and orgy dissolved completely. Participants took psychoactive mixtures, brewed from fermented grains, date wine, and extracts from sacred plants. One priest described it as drinking the breath of the gods. Another clay tablet reads, "They opened their mouths and the sun entered. They saw with eyes that were not theirs. Their limbs knew no shame." In these altered states, people claimed they were possessed by deities. And once possessed, all acts were permitted, no matter how violent, how grotesque, or how blasphemous under normal law. Slaves took command of ceremonies. Masters were stripped and paraded through the streets. Public sex became religious performance. Sodomy, group copulation, public masturbation, and ritual humiliation were rebranded as divine chaos. And no one could be punished for what happened. Not during Akitu. The gods had taken over. The festival celebrated the disintegration of order so it could be rebuilt anew. But when boundaries are dissolved, not everything comes back together. There are stories, fragments of reports and whispered records, of people who entered the temple and never came out. Not criminals. Not sacrifices. Worshippers. Possessed participants, often chosen for their beauty or fervor, were taken to the house of returning, a chamber believed to facilitate the complete fusion of soul and God. No one knows what happened inside. Some claim the participants died. Others say they were buried alive. Or worse, used in a rite that erased their names, their bodies, their memories. One recovered tablet bears a cryptic line. He was too full of the God. We broke his name so he would not shatter the world. What began as celebration ended in amnesia. Many woke from the haze with blood on their hands, strangers in their beds, and scars with no memories attached. Babies conceived during Akitu were sometimes considered cursed, called children of no name. And though Babylon returned to order after 12 days, something always remained behind in the shadows. A whisper. A shame. A face you couldn't quite forget but couldn't recognize either. Because Akitu wasn't just a festival. It was licensed insanity. A cosmic purge. And the gods always demanded a cost. You've lasted longer than 90% of viewers. Smash that subscribe button and honor those who were silenced. Or walk away like the rest, and leave a comment explaining why. They were never registered in the city rolls. Never claimed by family. Never expected to inherit land, marry, or even speak their own names outside the temple. They were the children of the moon, born not into homes but into shrines. Conceived in the shadows of sacred rites, raised behind stone walls, and trained from infancy for one purpose, to serve the gods in silence. Unlike orphans or war captives, these children weren't rescued. They weren't adopted. They were bred, born from priestesses, initiates, and sacred performers who conceived during ritual unions, many of which blurred the line between spiritual ecstasy and state-sanctioned abuse. The temples didn't see them as human heirs. They were seen as divine continuations, property of the gods. Archaeological excavations in Nippur, Sapar, and Larsa have revealed small, sealed quarters beneath larger temples, spaces with no access to sunlight, designed not for worship, but for habitation. Child-sized beds carved from clay. Tiny bowls and cups. Toys shaped like animals and deities. Murals depicting not family life but ritual scenes. These weren't orphanages. They were grooming chambers. In temple inventory records they're labeled not as sons or daughters, but as initiates, light-bringers, and echoes of the moon. The term moonborn appears frequently, indicating not just nocturnal birth, but symbolic purity, tied to the phases of the lunar goddess Sin. By the age of 5 or 6, these children began training in ritual choreography, sacred language recitation, and bodily obedience. Movements were timed to chants. Smiles practiced until they appeared effortless. Emotions stripped until nothing remained but discipline and precision. One recovered clay tablet, written in the voice of a temple scribe, details the child's schedule. Before the first moon they kneel. Before the second moon they bow. Before the third they bleed. This final phrase, they bleed, appears in multiple records, suggesting a symbolic or literal initiation marked by physical sacrifice, often aligned with puberty. Some were offered as performers. Others as living vessels, bodies consecrated for sexual rites enacted under divine sanction. The Babylonian legal codes offered protections for property, livestock, and temple goods. But children within temple service were not classified under civil law. They could not marry. They could not inherit. They could not testify. They had no legal identity outside the priesthood. This left them defenseless, fully at the mercy of those who claimed to speak for the gods. Priests were protected. Children were not. Any complaint, resistance, or rebellion was considered a spiritual defilement, a crime against divinity itself. Some moonborn children were never seen outside temple walls. Their lives began and ended in the same stone corridors, their names lost to unrecorded rituals, their deaths marked only by shattered pots placed at the corners of altars. And yet, there are stories, faint echoes buried in the margins of temple hymns, of children who whispered to each other in the dark, who carved symbols into walls where priests couldn't see, who remembered laughter even in silence. But memory was not enough to save them. Their lives were erased from civic record. Their suffering sanctified in liturgy. Their humanity overwritten by mythology. Because in ancient Babylon, to be born under the moon was to belong not to yourself, but to the gods who never asked for your permission. For centuries, the ruins of Mesopotamia whispered truths the world wasn't ready to hear. And when those whispers grew too loud, someone made sure they were silenced. While the temples of Babylon may have crumbled under time, conquest, and decay, much of their history remained preserved, etched into clay, hidden in the sands, waiting. But the story of what happened after those tablets were unearthed is not a tale of revelation. It's a tale of systematic erasure. In 2003, during the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the Baghdad Museum, home to the largest collection of Mesopotamian artifacts in the world, was looted in a matter of days. Over 15,000 items disappeared. Priceless tablets, ceremonial tools, temple records. Many of them were never recovered. Others reappeared quietly years later in private European collections, auction houses, and black market vaults. But even the tablets that survived didn't always make it into public view. Within Iraq and Syria, modern regimes, often guided by religious orthodoxy, have intentionally restricted archaeological access to temples associated with sexual rites. Sites once known to house gala priest quarters or ritual chambers are now fenced off, listed as politically sensitive or under indefinite review. And in the West, the suppression took a different shape. Many of the surviving Mesopotamian texts were translated under the supervision of UNESCO-funded academic committees. On the surface, their work seemed rigorous. But multiple early 20th century versions of major tablets, especially those from Uruk, Nippur, and Eridu, contain glaring omissions. Entire sections referencing ritual sex, child initiations, and sacred defloration were simply gone, replaced with blank space, or neutered with euphemisms like spiritual offering or ceremonial welcome, a Sumerian phrase that once read, "The priest placed the vessel in the lap of the goddess and took the first fruit of her body," was quietly transformed into, "The offering was presented in the spirit of joy." The erasure wasn't subtle. It was systematic. Even today, university syllabi skip the sexual dimensions of Mesopotamian worship almost entirely. Most museums display only agriculture, trade, and warfare. Temple rituals are framed as symbolic acts, ignoring the literal, physical, and violent truths buried in the clay. This pattern echoes another ancient cover-up. In Victorian-era Egyptology, when scholars uncovered sexually explicit tomb art and papyri, they plastered over it, burned it, or locked it away under museum floors labeled restricted access. The same is happening here, only this time the burial isn't physical. It's digital, academic, bureaucratic. As of today, over 3,000 untranslated tablets still sit in archives in London, Berlin, and Istanbul. Not because they can't be read, but because no one is funding their translation. Or because the content is deemed inappropriate for publication. In other words, history is being censored. And that censorship isn't ancient. It's happening now. Why? Because what lies in those tablets threatens too much. It shatters sanitized versions of religion. It implicates revered civilizations in horrors most historians would rather ignore. It forces us to confront the brutal reality that sacred texts were not always born from peace, but from domination, trauma, and control. And it forces us to ask, what else have they buried? Because this much is clear. What we know today is just a sliver of what they buried beneath the sands. They had no monuments, no statues carved in their image, no hymns sung in their name. The children who were born beneath temple roofs. The priests who were emptied to house the gods. The girls who bled before altars as incense filled their lungs. They were never meant to be remembered. They were ritual tools, not human stories. And yet, in the silence of crumbling tablets and the dark corners of museum basements, their voices remain. Faint, fragmented, but still here. Not one of them chose their fate. They were born into it, trained for it, destroyed by it. And all of it, every ceremony, every scar, was carried out in the name of the divine. Because when religion answers only to itself, when there is no balance, no scrutiny, no accountability, it becomes something else. It becomes a machine. One that sanctifies obedience. One that rewards silence. One that transforms abuse into worship and chains into blessings. This isn't just a story about ancient Babylon. It's a warning. About what happens when human power cloaks itself in divine authority. When the veil of godliness becomes the mask for control. Because the line between divinity and depravity was far thinner than we were taught. And too often the gods we worshipped looked the other way. Before you go, If this story shook something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video. Comment below with the part that haunted you the most. And share it with someone who still thinks ancient religion was pure. Subscribe to the History Scar for more forbidden truths that history tried to bury. Because the past isn't gone. It's just been censored.